In this video, I will tell you how I've spent 20k hours mixing as a sound engineer and the main insights I got. Hello, my name is Ivan and I'm an engineer at Major Mixing, a company that provides online mixing and mastering services. We make sure that your music sounds great and matches all industry standards. The first thing I've learned after years of working in mixing and mastering is that music production and composition are everything. It doesn't really matter how you mix, what gadgets you use, and what type of studio you have, because if you want to create a great sound, nothing can quite compare to high-quality music production and original composition. If you have these two components in check, you can do some light mixing and have a music hit on your hands as a result. Without these two elements, no matter what studio you use, you won't have good sound. As a music producer, you should focus 80 to 90% of your efforts on creating a high-quality composition with top-notch music production. The second thing I realized is that the sound engineer should be closer to people. Many mixing engineers and music producers have this problem of losing touch with the listener. They spend a lot of time working in the studio and talking solely with people involved in music production. They watch sound engineering-related content and, as a result, they get themselves into an informational vacuum that separates them from the listener. This, in turn, leads to various long-term problems. Why should we pay more attention to people who listen to music? Because, in the end, they're paying money for what we produce. That's why we should be in tune with them, learning about the ways they perceive music. The majority of people don't use high-tech gadgets to listen to music. They use cheap speakers and earbuds, not paying attention to all those details valued by sound engineers. That's why we should listen to music the same way they do, on the go, in the car, and even in the shower. As a result, you will better understand what these people need and how you can make your music better as a sound engineer. The next statement is a bit controversial and it goes like this: you can't replace brand plugins with stock ones. It's true that all professionals on the internet say that you don't really need to use brand plugins and you can do all the mixing and mastering using stock plugins that are pre-installed in your software. But the truth is, if you open any major release and look at the manual of how the mixing was done by professional sound engineers, you will not find a single session that uses stock plugins. As a rule, 95 to 99 of plugins would be from brands like Waves Audio, FabFilter, Universal Audio, or some analog emulators. If you want to get that delicious sound provided by brand plugins while using stock ones, you will need to spend an indefinite amount of time mixing, and still, you won't get the same result. If you spend too much time on music production, you may get tired and lose your train of thought and inspiration. That's why you just need to accept the simple fact that brand plugins are better in general, especially analog sound emulators. Being a mixing engineer myself, I refused to believe it was true for a long time, thinking that things like this didn't matter. But as time went by, I realized that all my sessions made with high-quality plugins sounded much more professional. That's why the sooner you accept that brand plugins aren't the same as stock ones, the better music you will make. The next thing I realized is that major artists often know more about music than sound engineers. Sometimes, mixing engineers may listen to some crazy idea and think it doesn't make any sense, when in reality, they need to understand that artists are creative and they think out of the box. They may ask you to do something illogical that goes against all the rules of mixing and mastering, but in the end, it would sound amazing. That's why sometimes you simply need to remove your ego and turn off that inner sound engineer professional and do as you're told. You have to remember that major artists know what they're doing, so you can trust them on this. Just make sure that you're working with a professional who is an established major artist or has the potential to become one. How can you tell them from the rest of the artists? They're very knowledgeable, disciplined, and they usually know what they want and how it should be done. If you're working with a person like this, you can relax and simply follow their lead. Next, you should know a red flag when you see one. This concerns not only sound engineers but also music producers and even artists. If you start working with a disorganized person who sends you a chaotic session with files that aren't named properly and you can't understand what's happening, that's a red flag right there. In 95% of cases, if you continue working with this type of artist, they won't become successful and they'll drag you down along with them. If you recognize yourself in this description as an artist, this is your opportunity to pull yourself together and organize everything properly. Music production is a business and should be treated as such. Next, we're going to talk about something very obvious, but I should still mention it. Volume automation and balance are the key elements to your success as a sound engineer. There were so many times when I simply tweaked the balance here and there, changed the volume a little, and the artist was stunned by the result, asking me what plugins I used to achieve such an amazing sound, when in reality all this was created due to simple volume automation. Another story I have from my own practice is when I used an analog console for mixing and created two samples of the track. The only difference between them was the volume, and I used nothing but faders to tweak the sound. It was the same singer and the same track, but the two mixes sounded completely different thanks to volume automation. That's why you should spend more time on creating the right balance of sound, because that's the most important element of your mix. It's much more important than the tech and plugins you use for mixing and mastering. Another thing you should pay attention to is saturation. Many people underestimate this element, although it's responsible for 15% of your success as a sound engineer. So, why should you spend extra time on saturation, choosing distortion for each track? Saturation is a multi-component thing that affects the frequency response of the signal. It can add some harmonics that weren't there before. As a result, it changes the color of the sound, making it brighter, darker, crunchier, clearer, and adding more or less noise. Along with saturation, you will also get compression because all saturators additionally compress the sound. Therefore, if you made the right mix and then place the correct saturators, distortion, channel strip, and tape emulators, you will get a 90 to 95% finished mix. You can watch the reviews of professional mixes made by pro sound engineers. This is how they do it. First comes the volume automation, and then they add saturation and play with the color and character of the sound. Many of them add compressors in the initial state that don't actually compress sound, but instead add some harmonics, making the mix sound juicier. The next important thing I found out after working in the industry for many years is the ability of a sound engineer to mix with quiet monitors. The speakers you're using should be on the lowest possible volume. This will save your hearing. If you're planning to work for many years, you can't have your monitors on 70 dB all the time. You should learn how to do quiet mixing, because at some point you will have to lower the volume, and it will be the same as learning how to do mixing all over again. Another perk of using low volume on speakers is that you can hear the middle better due to the Fletcher-Munson curve. The majority of smartphones, speakers, and earbuds sound the best in mid-range. That's why you should focus on these frequencies. Your success lies here. When you do the mixing on quiet speakers, you naturally use the middle frequencies more. Therefore, your track will sound juicy on all the devices. The next insight follows from this one. You, as a sound engineer, sometimes can and even should do the mixing on headphones. This allows you to hear the low frequencies with all the accents, clicks, and nuances that you wouldn't notice otherwise. When mixing on headphones, you also become closer to the consumer of your music, and that helps you create better sounding tracks for them. I had an experience of transitioning from studio monitors to headphones. It turns out that my clients like the mixes I created using headphones more than the ones I made using monitors. That's why why I still use mostly headphones and no longer believe that a professional sound engineer should only work on the studio monitors. You can also use headphones. That's totally acceptable. The next point I want to mention is that you need to use references. When you come to sound engineer with a session, you should have references to help him understand what exactly you want to sound like. A professional mixing engineer can mix a track to sound dark, deep, clear, or crisp. There's 1,000 ways to mix one song. They will all sound good to the listener, but they may not sound the way you imagined it. That's why ordering a mixing and mastering work without references is a grave mistake. References help the sound engineer create exactly what you envisioned, saving you both time and money. In my practice, I can do a mix according to my understanding, even without referencing, but in most cases, I'll have to redo it because the artist wants something different. So they end up looking for references either way. In my experience, the most popular songs had references from the very beginning of the music production. This helps professionals understand each other better when they communicate. You as an artist tell your vision to the sound producer, and he in turn explains it to the sound engineer. And in the end, you have a coherent outcome that sounds just as you want it to. Just accept the fact that looking for references is inevitable. It's always good to have up to 3 references, so you don't steal other people's sound, you just use it to understand what's trending in the music industry right now. The next thing I want to point out is that all those mixing tips are useless. They are created simply to generate traffic on social media platforms, and they distract you from what's really important: learning the actual skills. If you spend enough time learning how everything works, compressors, saturators, and balance, you will never need all those mixing tips. All you need to do is practice more and do as many mixes as possible to hone your skills. All those tips are the same everywhere. As a sound engineer, I can open any of my sessions and generate 100 of those tips, but they'll be useless to you. In fact, they can even harm you because you will be distracted learning some tricks instead of mastering the actual skills. You will only lose precious time trying to figure out some complex equalizers or compressor settings that were used in a song once and probably won't be used ever again in the same way. So my advice to you is to forget about those tips and save your time to do some actual studying. Another insight I had is that the faster you do the mixing, the better the outcome. How so? When you work fast, you quickly get ideas and apply them immediately. You also don't lose the initial inspiration you got when you first heard the song and understood what type of sound you wanted to create. The best way to work is to start mixing right away without getting hung up to details. If you work on a kick for 20 minutes, you'll get stuck and lose the original idea for the mix. That's why you should learn how to mix fast, at least the first sprint. You can spend 20 to 30 minutes on that, bringing the initial concept to life. You can even add a limiter to make it sound more professional. After that, you can spend more time working on details. The next point I want to mention sounds like this: no processing is always better. You should find ways to do the mixing with as little processing as possible. If it's a professional release, then a lot of people worked hard for days, weeks, or even months on this track trying to achieve this exact sound. The more processing you do, the further you get from the original sound they envisioned. Too much processing always results in sound distortion. If you use equalizers on the track, you'll get some sustain and harmonics that weren't initially there, along with the phase distortion. That's why you should pay attention to professional reviews. For example, if you look at a high-quality mix from the masters, you will notice it has only a few plugins in the whole session. So the less you process the sound, the better. Just by tweaking balances and saturation, you can reach amazing results with close to no plugins. My next insight is that mono matters. Many professional sound engineers say that mono doesn't matter because no one listens to it and people use stereo sound only. This is partly true, but there's a thing. Although we listen to music using stereo sound systems like speakers or headphones, we often listen to mono sound without even realizing it. For example, imagine you turn on the music at home using a soundbar or speakers, and you go on about your day, do some vacuuming, cleaning, or preparing dinner. So, what happens when you go to a different room? That's right, You're listening to an acoustic mono sound that's created when you get further from the speakers. A lot of people listen to music this way. That's why you should also pay attention to mono sound. You don't need to go crazy about mono compatibility, but you still have to check it. This essentially matters for concerts with big sound systems that use bass in mono, and when people stand further from the speakers, the sound will become mono anyway. The next thing I want to point out is that it's important to listen to the mixes that you've done before. Create a playlist with your favorite mixes and listen to them from time to time, along with the older ones. You have a lot of insights about the mixing you should never do again, and maybe even a few new ideas from the way you mixed tracks back in the day. You can also switch to something like Billboard Top 100 and see how your songs sound compared to that music. This way, you'll understand whether your mixes can compete with those hits and what you need to do to make them better. As a result, you can boost your competitiveness and create high-quality mixes. Another insight I want to share with you today is similar to the one I mentioned in the beginning of this video, that you should be closer to ordinary people. This is why you should ask your friends, family, and other people who aren't involved in music production for advice. As people who listen to music, they can give you feedback that no professional can ever give. Always ask what they have to say, because most of the time, they will notice some details no one else would. The last insight I have for you today is that you should learn all the rules of sound engineering and then forget all about them. We create music, and this process doesn't have strict rules you should always follow. You should know about them, but then you should break some or all of them to create unique sound and interesting composition. This is how original music is made. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe to get our latest updates. If you need online mixing and mastering services, feel free to contact us.